So
Okay.
this week and next week, we're going to start talking about make to order and make to stock contracts, and we're going to talk about incentives
I actually
and
I actually mentioned that on one of the
discussion questions.
or no, the discussion boards I talked about. He said, I responded. I think it was Andrew's thing. He said, "Well, what about uh, man-made catastrophes? Like, what if you have a vendor-controlled thing?" He's one of his things is we had a strike, and our vendor was supposed to provide uh, compressed gas, and I was like, and my response was, well, your vendor should have had a contingency in there that if
Yeah,
he couldn't provide it, then he should, like, if his company can't provide it, then he should have something in his contract that he would
sure.
have arrangements to have a subcontractor do it.
Yeah, and this is where I'm going to talk about distributors, and this is where the Japanese system really shines because I think I wrote an announcement where I talked about this. Japanese business culture has a lot of middlemen, a lot of distributors, and a lot of people in the United States will say, well, that increases costs because you're adding more people to the chain. But what it does is um, it allows the distributor to pull from more sources to address variation. In the case of the Fukushima disaster, Toyota, their operations weren't as impacted as you would think. Though obviously they were, but what they did was because they had distributors that had multiple sources for their products, they were able to pull, aggregation of variation in demand. Not all of them were hit the same. Some were hit really bad, some were hit really low. So, because, like, for instance, there was one example that I read about this where Toyota had five um, five sources for an engine fuel injection part, and I guess it's a critical part of an engine as far as the manufacturing goes for them. But their lead time didn't change because their distributor said, "Oh no, we've got four other companies that can provide the same part and they're on contract, and they can provide them to you right now." So they went to all these other companies, and then they were able to pull from the other companies to meet the sudden loss of supply from that one supplier. I'll talk a little bit about the distributor role later on, but that's a very effective way of reducing variation. Like I mentioned when we talked about aggregating demand in your risk pooling, the Japanese flip it around and use the risk pooling in their supply chain by having multiple suppliers. And that's how they reduce the variation. Sure, you can say it does increase costs. Of course, yeah, you know, because you don't have one person providing the economies of scale, but your ability to absorb variation in your supply chain is greater. So when we talk about how we deal with contracts, we usually focus on what is called a sequential supply chain. This is a very generic supply chain that we've talked about since week one, where basically a buyer places an order based upon what is demand, okay, and the supplier builds units based upon what is ordered by the buyer. Very simple, you know. But what happens in this scenario is the buyer has a risk when they purchase stuff and they can't sell it. Basically, stuff stays on the shelves. And the supplier assumes a risk if they build too much and the buyer doesn't buy it. Basically, they have excess inventory. So what happens in this scenario is there's a systems theory that when you optimize each part of a system, the system is sub-optimized because to be able to get the best out of a system, you need to optimize the interaction of the parts and not the parts taken separately. This is very true for supply chains. So what happens in this scenario, the buyer is only going to order just enough products to meet demand and reduce the risk of excess inventory on their shelves. The supplier, conversely, will only build enough to fill orders and no more because they don't want the inventory in their warehouses. Okay. So as a result, each party optimizes their own profitability by minimizing risk. The profitability of the entire chain is greater if the supply chain is managed as a system than it is if it's managed individually. With each part individually. And the book has the lecture notes has a pretty good but lengthy example of this, which shows that the maximum profitability within the supply chain is greater if these parts work together. Okay.
We talked about this.
We did, yeah. Briefly, we did in one of our discussions. I didn't go into a lot of detail because we're going to go into a lot of detail this week.
No, we talked about this in operations, in my operations class, about three different operations. You had made to order, you had continuous operations, and you had basically custom order. What was it? So there was three different supply lines. It was just like this. It was the operations side of what you're talking about right here.
Sure, yeah, and I love operations because a lot of what operations deals with, you could apply to supply chain. And in the most effective programs I've been on, operations works closely with supply chain because in essence, the supply chain becomes part of the operations. So the operations is vulnerable to the same sub-optimization in the sense that the supply chain is. Unfortunately, like we mentioned in like week 1 or week 2, in most programs I've been on, in most companies, supply chain is separated from operations. That's just the way that we design organizations.
Shouldn't be.
No, not so much to make operations a part of supply chain or vice versa, but to create a system in which the two interact together. Because as you said, and I can think of a couple of good examples where they each benefit from helping the other out. Like operations, and this is famous, operations says, hey, we have this upcoming order, we're going to need to order extra parts, but the supply chain goes, well, I got to give these guys extra, advance notice, and who's going to pay for these extra parts, and all this other stuff. All of a sudden, you start getting these lines in the sand, where, like we said here, the buyer is incentivized to buy just enough products to avoid excess inventory on their shelves, and the supplier is incentivized to make just enough product to avoid having inventory in their warehouse.
Yeah.
So as a result, you get frequency oscillations where you may have what I've seen frequently is in one time, and we're going to talk about this in the bullwhip effect. And there's some of the students in their discussion questions were saying that, and I can understand why they would say this, that the bullwhip effect is caused by inventory fluctuations. Well, it's not. It's the inventory fluctuations are a symptom. They're not the cause. So in this case, when we have a suboptimized supply chain, you may have one period where the buyer does not buy enough to meet demand. So all of a sudden you have a shortage. And all of a sudden the buyer goes, oh my goodness, I need to order extra to meet the expected demand plus whatever back orders we may have. So they bump up the order. The supplier, suddenly goes, okay, well, I have this order and I'm going to make a whole bunch of stuff. The buyer just bought more stuff. So I'm going to ramp up because there's a lag in the forecasting, obviously. I'm going to ramp up and start to make more. But all of a sudden, the buyer immediately in the next phase realizes that that was a temporary variation and that the actual demand did not change. So the buyer suddenly orders less, but the supplier is still making a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
So now all of a sudden you get these oscillations where all of a sudden the buyer, because there's a delay due to inaccurate demand forecasting, the buyer doesn't realize that he screwed up until like 2 or 3 cycles. Well, now he suddenly has all the stuff on his shelves. And it's funny because where I live in Dubai, you have a lot of small shops. And I actually watch this. I used to buy green tea at this shop, and I used to buy it like 2 bottles a day. And what I would do as an experiment, I would buy 2 bottles a day for a month. So I'd buy 60 bottles. The next month, you'd have like 6 bottles in there. They go, oh my goodness, the demand went up. Well, I can't drink 6 bottles a day. So I keep buying 2, and over time, it'll go from 6 to 7 to 8. And all of a sudden, like 4 or 5 months later, it'll go to 0. Because what happens is the buyer restricts the order because, oh my God, I have all this over inventory. I'm gonna wait until all my stuff is sold. But what happens is, and that happens, their stock eventually, I can see where they had like 8 bottles of green tea, it'll go down to 6, 5, 4, 2, then they'd have none. Then I'd wait a month, and then they'd have 2 again. Then the cycle starts again. And this is a byproduct of the suboptimization. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So
You've probably seen this before too.
Well, it's got to be hard. Like, so you got, and obviously I'm in the Navy, so it's got to be frustrating for the DoD supply system because you have ships obviously with their avcal and their loadouts that you got screws that have been on ships for 25 years that are never ordered, and in the one time that they need it, they haven't ordered it from that UIC or that that
NSN, yeah,
that organization code, and all of a sudden they've ordered and they haven't ordered it in 6 years, and they're showing usage, and then it shows as all of a sudden they don't have it and now they need it.
Then they get too much.
And then they get too much.
Yeah. Yeah. And the DoD is their own worst enemy because they have these yearly procurement cycles. So any variation in demand over that year isn't felt by the DoD contractors until, in some cases, the next year. And all of a sudden, what do you need? What do you mean you need more money for this? Yeah, you're showing more demand. Then you have like DMS, diminishing material spares, basically things, obsolescence issues, where all of a sudden, you have all this demand, and all of a sudden, I have a very good example of this where we have a system that was slowly going obsolete, and all of a sudden the customer said, "Oh, we want to fly this for like 2 more years," so we bought loads of spares from anyone that basically made it before they went obsolete. Well, the forecast was wrong. The forecast said we needed 2 years worth of spares. We unfortunately needed 5 years worth of spares because the customer flew them for longer than expected and for more flight hours than expected.
Yeah. Because they'll say the master airplane will say, "Oh, we're going to use this for 2 years," and then the next master airplane, which is a year later, like, "Oh, sure. Well, we were wrong last year. We're actually going to use this for 6 more years," and then
sure. So in a supply chain reference, if our demand forecasting was not based on 6 years, or on 2 years, or 5 years, if you said, "Hey, look, we're going to focus on demand forecasting for 6-month updates," and you have a procurement system that can provide funding in like 6-month pockets or 2-month pockets, then you'll see the suppliers are better able to absorb that risk. But when you have these forecasts come out once a year, and what's that demand forecast based on? So based on these examples, obviously, when each part of a supply chain optimizes themselves, it sub-optimizes the entire supply chain. And that's important to remember. And this same with operations, same with any system. That is a systems thinking fundamental basic. If you optimize the parts, you sub-optimize the whole.
Yeah, and then we all wonder where all the money's going because then they run out of supply.
Exactly. Like your example with Nintendo. I think Nintendo would. I was laughing internally at the discussion going back and forth because you both had very valid points. I can see how Nintendo's like, I don't want to keep all this stuff out because I got this 18-month obsolescence curve. I want to make as little as possible, but then you have shortages, and then people go, well, crap! If I can't buy the Nintendo, I'll go buy a PS, a PlayStation, And then of course, if you have too much, then now you have all the stuff you can't get rid of, or you have to have salvage cost. So I can see both sides, but all that told me is that Nintendo does not have a very disciplined supply system.
Well, I think they have a plan, actually.
Yeah, maybe it's a planned. Yeah, it's quite possible.
I think they create. Well, I was talking to a buddy of mine about that specifically. So all these classic things that they release, they're releasing it to a very specific audience. And they do it right before Christmas. So who are the people that are going to buy this classic Nintendo? It's going to be people from 30 to about 45.
Yeah. First adopters. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's going to be a very limited, peer group. So it's going to be Christmas presents, and it's going to be.
Yeah.
So right after Christmas, they're going to probably have a hard time selling those.
Yeah. You bring up a very good point that's not related to this week, but it's one that's good to highlight. A lot of marketers and within a supply chain, the distributor stuff, there's a tactic where you increase the price of a good through artificial scarcity.
Yeah.
And that's what you're talking about. Unfortunately, you have to understand the replacement value and the customer service level of that product. If the replacement value, if it's easy to replace, I can go buy a PlayStation instead of a Nintendo, and the customer has a very low service level. Basically, a video game is a video game. I don't care as long as it's something that gives me fun and it works when I turn on the TV. They'll move. Your ability to create artificial scarcity effectively is minimized.
Yeah.
So Apple fortunately has a high customer service level. The replacement value is shifting though. Samsung's starting to make phones that are as good, if not better, than Apple for various customer things. But okay. So back to this: make-to-order contracts. A make-to-order contract is a contract in which the supplier does not build the units until the order is received, and the buyer pays for all the units ordered. Okay, and this is used by manufacturers to push all the risk onto the buyer. They basically say, "Hey, look, you place the order, we fill it."
Basically, what Apple does with Foxconn.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So obviously, the buyer assumes all the risk because they have to have very good forecasting. They can't. There's no shared risk here. And the supplier has a profitability that's limited due to overstocking. Okay. So basically, if there's excess of stock on the buyer's shelves, it has to pay the salvage cost to get rid of that excess of stock. Okay. So that's basically the supplier will build as little as possible because it wants all of the excess stock to be paid for by the buyer. Okay. So its profitability is limited due to overstocking because the buyer is not going to buy anything that they manufacture beyond what was in the order. So as a result, the supplier is still going to make as little as possible to meet the order that the supplier puts in. Now, make-to-stock contracts is kind of like the opposite. So now, the buyer basically places an order based on the demand forecast, and the buyer says, "Hey, look, you are responsible for providing X level of products in my supply chain." And so as a result, the supplier is mandated to maintain a certain level of stock in the supply system to meet this demand forecast. But the buyer only buys what they consume. Okay. So the supplier basically, this shifts all of the burden to the supplier, because now the supplier basically has to provide a certain level of inventory to the buyer. The buyer doesn't pay for it until basically it is almost until it is consumed. Okay. Because what the buyer does basically says, "Hey, look, as long as I have X, you have to keep X." Oops, there's a chat. Hold on a minute, I can pull up my chat. So, oh, okay, got it. Thank you. So yeah, so the buyer profitability is limited due to the risk of shortages, because once again, the supplier is going to build as little as possible, because the supplier has to pay salvage costs from excess stock. The buyer has a risk that the supplier will not be able to meet the amount of product that's placed on the order. So in this scenario, the supplier is incentivized to build as few units as possible. In the make to order, the buyer is incentivized to order as few units as possible to avoid overstock on the shelves. In make to stock is the opposite. The supplier is incentivized to build as few units as possible to avoid the risk in their warehouse. So these are two ways that contracts are written, either from the buyer's perspective or the supplier's perspective, to optimize their own gains within that system. Now, we're going to talk about incentives. And incentives are used as a means to spread risk amongst the supply chain. Once again, when you optimize the parts of the supply chain, you suboptimize the supply chain as a whole. So incentives are used by the buyer or the seller to encourage the other party to assume more risk. And this is usually done by the other party taking on more risk. Okay, and basically this, as it says here, the buyer is incentivized to buy more products in a make-to-order contract. Usually the buyer is only gonna buy enough product from the supplier to meet the highest level of expected demand. Well, now the supplier is going to incentivize the buyer to take some risk. Okay, and vice versa. There are incentives so that the buyer can encourage the supplier to produce more products. Sometimes if a buyer, like in a previous example, if the buyer expects increased demand due to sales or whatever, they can incentivize the supplier to provide more products and assume more risk, because they're going to take on some of that risk themselves. So, and we're going to talk, the textbook briefly goes over these. There's three types: buyback contracts, revenue sharing, quantity flexibility, and sales rebates. And I'm going to go over these briefly. In a buyback contract, it's very simple. The supplier says, "Hey, look, if you order X amount of product and you don't sell them all, we will buy back anything that you don't sell for a certain price. Now, this price is usually not the wholesale price. It's usually a price set just above the salvage cost. In some cases, it can be above the wholesale price. It just depends. But bottom line is, this price is agreed upon by both parties, and it has to be above the salvage cost, because the salvage cost is what the buyer has to pay for taking on the risk for excess stock. If the price is below the salvage cost, there'll be no incentive, or there'll be less incentive because they're not going to get the full salvage cost for the product. So it has to be a price above the salvage cost. So in this example, the buyer is incentivized to buy more units and accept more risk, because the supplier is saying, hey, look, we're going to mitigate your risk by offsetting the costs of unsold units. Okay. And this risk is mitigated by cost sharing across all parties. So obviously, and this obviously is typically used in make-to-order contracts, where the supplier is trying to encourage the buyer to purchase more of their inventory. Very simple. Revenue sharing. The buyer seeks to increase the amount of units provided by the supplier by sharing revenue with the supplier in exchange for a discount on the unit price. And you've probably seen this before. They say, hey, look, give me a discount on the unit price so that I can provide a discount to my customer, and any revenue that I get on this discounted price unit, we will share. So what this does, this encourages the supplier to make more units, but also encourages the supplier to improve, to be more cost efficient. Okay, because if the supplier is incentivized and is able to drop the unit price and still make money, then they could sell more products, and they also get revenue sharing with the buyer on top of that. Sometimes you hear about in supply chains break-even points, and what happens, especially like in my field, when you first start building something, it's expensive, and over time you become more efficient at making the product. Either you get more in-house knowledge on how the product functions, you design it so it's easier to build, whatever. So you may say, hey, look, we will be willing to discount the initial unit price because our cost to make the unit may have gone down. And in exchange, the buyer says, fine, we will share the revenue on what we sell in exchange for a discount, so that we can offer a discount to the customer to encourage more demand. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Good. So yeah, these are typically used in make-to-stock contracts because the buyer is trying to have the supplier take on more risk. Okay. Now, quantity flexibility contracts. I haven't seen a lot of these, but I've been told that some industries do use these. So basically, the supplier says, look, if you order 1,000 units, we will buy back anything that you do not sell up to a certain point. So let's say if the refund level is 100 units, the buyer basically says, okay, as long as I sell 900 units, I'll still be okay. So this encourages the buyer to take a little bit of risk by accepting more risk up to the refund level. Does that make sense? So the buyer is encouraged to purchase units up to the refund level, which that just basically encourages the buyer to be less risk averse. And this is usually used in make to order contracts, because obviously the supplier is trying to encourage the buyer to order more products by saying, look, we will share in your risk by buying back a certain level of products. Have you seen that a lot in your industry? I know that like in tech, you have obsolescence issues, so I don't know if that would be something that you guys would do. Have you seen that at all?
Not really. I'm actually still in the Navy, so
Okay. Yeah, I haven't. In defense, I'm trying to think. In defense, I don't think I've seen that. Yeah, maybe in other industries. Maybe I'll ask around. So sales rebates. We talked about this a few weeks ago. We're obviously where the supplier provides a rebate to the retailer for any unit sold over a certain quantity, and in return, the retailer provides a rebate to the customer, and then the customer fills out the paperwork and jumps through hoops to get the money from the rebate from the retailer. Now note that I didn't write this here, but the retailer is in a win-win situation, okay, where the retailer gets the supplier to provide a rebate on what they sell, and they are able to encourage a lower price, and if they sell X number of units but not all of the rebates are claimed, they get to keep that money.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of rebates. I just don't trust them.
Yeah, rebates have gotten better over the years. Like for instance, like rebates that you get at the cash register. I like those. Those make sense. Sure. But yeah, mail-in rebates, ones where you gotta buy 7 of this in order to get this small rebate here. It's like, okay, yeah, I understand what you're trying to do. You're trying to encourage demand for these other objects by linking it with a rebated item. I understand that. But yeah, rebates. But the rebates aren't really aimed at customers or at increasing demand. I guess they are kind of, but they're really aimed at increasing. Well, they are in the fact that they're trying to increase sales of a certain product. Sometimes, like I think we mentioned during the rebates class, where sometimes if there's a new router or a new phone coming out, they may do rebates to get rid of the old stock. So
Yeah.
usually rebates are used for overstocks.
What I've seen rebates in more is like, oddly enough, I've seen like government rebates lately. Mostly pushed by like gas and power companies.
Oh, for
Or
like
like
tax rebates.
kind of, but like, so Virginia Gas or Virginia Power was like, okay, buy one of these thermostats and install it in your house, and we'll give you a $25 rebate on your gas bill, or update your HVAC, we'll give you this for your house, so forth.
Yeah, government tax policies are aimed at discouraging certain behaviors. And that's just one of the many theories about taxes. So, in your example, the government wants to have people use less gas. Let's say, for this example, the government has deemed that using natural gas is harmful to the environment. Although, to be fair, it's actually more kind than other fossil fuels. But we'll just, in this example, we'll just say that the government wants to discourage the use of natural gas. So they'll say, hey, look, we're going to provide a tax incentive for people to reduce consumption by putting in thermostats.
Yeah.
And they will actually provide incentives to companies to do that. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I guess in theory they can go straight to the consumer and say, hey, look, put in this thermostat. But in many cases they'll say, hey, company, we're going to give you incentives to reduce consumption of natural gas, and we'll do this by providing this much tax incentive to the company.
Yeah.
And then the tax company, then the company will flow that down. Very much the way this works. Okay. There are sometimes, like in California, there are explicit, like for instance, they'll say, when I lived in California, they gave a direct rebate to the consumer for buying solar panels. So now all of a sudden, people who made solar panels in California realize this, and it increased demand, and then you had all these sales for solar panels, and they would basically factor in the rebate in the solar panels, and in some cases, solar panel companies would actually fill out the paperwork for the tax refund for the consumer. So the way that the government does it is very similar to this rebate model. You're absolutely right.
So I mean, but I don't know. There's something so kind of. It just kind of reminds me. I don't know. Maybe it's the era I grew up in of sleazy car salesman ish about.
Yeah, well, back when I grew up, you know, I'm not gonna date myself, but all of the rebates growing up were all like mail-in rebates.
Yeah.
Or you had to collect so many stamps, or do all this stuff by gather so many box tops before you got a certain rebate. And yeah, there is an explicit agreement where if you did A, you got B, but implicitly A has some difficulty. So as a result, all the risk is on the consumer, because the consumer works kind of like a buyer in this case, where they take the risk. If you buy, let's say if you buy 5 boxes of cereal and you got to cut the tops off and you mail them in, so you get your rebate on your other box of cereal, and something happens, dog ate the homework, whatever, the risk falls on the consumer,
Right.
because the guy that sold the cereal has already got the money from you.
Right.
So in that case, yeah, you're right. It's an uneven risk. Nowadays I'm not so hung up on the instant rebates. Like if I go to Best Buy, I went to Best Buy yesterday to buy my parents a new phone, and I was able to get a rebate on it, at the cash register. Great, no problem. I can understand that, But you're right, the traditional rebate structure, yeah, sometimes.
I mean, I got no problem with like instant rebates or, things of that nature, but the rebates as they used to be, there's something just a little suspect about them.
Yeah, I agree. Okay. Now, distributors. We had a video con a few weeks back where it was you and Roberto, or it was Diotis, maybe. We were talking about a distributor role in a supply chain, and we pretty much were saying, yeah, they don't really have a role anymore when we come up with the what's that? VMI. I kept thinking Virginia Military Institute. It's like, no, that's not it. But so when we have an instance where the distributor basically gets in the way of products flowing between suppliers and the end user, the distributor role is kind of minimized. But in this kind of system, the distributor can work as a means to mitigate risk. Okay, if you remember from the sequential chain, okay, the buyer is incentivized to buy as little as possible from the supplier because it doesn't want excess inventory. But what the distributor can say is, hey, look, if you buy extra stuff, I have access to additional buyers that maybe we could shift your excess stock to. Okay.
I.e. like big lots, overstock.
Yep. Well, yeah. Well, that's like a salvage cost mitigation. But like, let's say you say, look, you aren't willing to buy 100 of this item. Well, I have another retailer that might want to buy 50. tell you what, if you guys buy 175, the distributor can say, look, I will keep the extra 25, and as long as you guys order the 175, I'll keep the extra 25, and I will move it to whoever needs it the most, using aggregation of variation of demand. And then the distributor can use like a buyback contract, or the other ones, for whatever's left over. So a distributor can work as a way to mitigate risk between multiple sellers. Okay. Now, in the case of suppliers, they can say, look, I have access to multiple customers, so I want to encourage you to make more stuff, because then I can provide more stuff to my multiple suppliers. Okay. And in many cases, distributors can provide incentives to the supplier to do that. In many cases, they'll do it in conjunction with strategies with the buyers also. So distributors have a particular role within this type of structure by being able to mitigate risk through using these types of contracts. Okay. Now, in the case of like Walmart, where they control everything, a distributor doesn't have much leeway, But saying that, though, Walmart does use some distributors. I don't think they use very many, but they use some.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. So VMI, Walmart uses some VMI, but not everything is VMI.
In my opinion of Walmart, they go about as far as you can. You can't have a perfect VMI system. You'll always have a little bit of delay in forecasting. You'll have a little bit of delay in getting the information to other people, no matter how fast you are. You'll always be vulnerable to manufacturer variation in their ability to provide products. You'll always have variation in the ability of a certain location to get goods to a certain location. Snow, earthquakes, whatever. So VMI can't be completely perfect. So Walmart uses distributors as a way to mitigate that risk, in my opinion. I haven't talked to Walmart people, so I can't verify this for sure, but that's what it looks like it is for me. They'll use like 3PLs as a type of distributor to move products from low variation areas to high variation areas. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah. Once again, this is just me, total conjecture. I don't know for sure, but from what I see, that's what I think is going on. So this helps to identify the distributor role within a supply chain. They can use these types of incentives due to their position within a supply chain to encourage everyone in the supply chain to take more risk. And there was another type of incentive that they talked about in the book. I forgot what it was called, but I'll see if I can find it real quick. But there's one in which you have like a third party that arbitrates on behalf of all the parties to determine the optimum level to buy, optimum level to build. And that's kind of what the distributor would do. Does that make sense?
Yeah. We're in
I'm going to look it up right now. It is called I didn't put down because it's not really used much. It's called Global Optimization Strategy. So, and that's on page 128. They don't really say much, but basically it says here the transfer of money between parties is ignored, and the unbiased decision maker will maximize supply chain profit. So basically, both parties, the supplier and the buyer, places some trust in the distributor to make decisions for both of them that maximizes profit for everybody. Okay.
Okay.
So, All right, and that's really it. This week's fairly simple. Basically, it's just adding on to some of the last weeks that we've talked about. Now it's adding a little bit of theory to those concepts. So from here on out, the workload should be quite a bit less. I know that week 5 and 6 was a bit rough for